I rise this evening to lead a special order alongside my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to discuss a crisis afflicting our nation. It's the crisis of missing and murdered indigenous women. Each of the members speaking tonight represent different regions of the United States and different Native communities who are all affected by the disproportionate number of crimes against Native American and Alaska Native women. My colleagues and I have introduced several pieces of legislation, including Savannah's Act and the Badges for Native Communities Act, in an attempt to improve collaboration between law enforcement agencies and empower them to seriously work toward solving many of these unsolved cases. Over the next hour, I look forward to hearing each of these members' unique perspective on ways we can work to solve this crisis and bring justice to these women. I've spoken on this topic a number of times, here on the floor, in the House Judiciary Committee, and at home with my constituents who have been directly affected by this crisis. While a lot that I might say here tonight, Mr. Speaker, may sound like a broken record, I apologize for that, but I cannot stress enough how important it is that we use our voices as U.S. representatives to address a crisis of this magnitude and offer solutions for these women and their families and their communities. Native women throughout the country face a murder rate 10 times higher than the national average, with 84% experiencing some kind of violence in their lifetimes. In my home state of Washington, Native Americans make up about 2% of the population, but a recent report by the Washington State Patrol shows that indigenous women account for 7% of the state's reported missing women. This crisis is one that affects communities in both highly populated urban areas as well as rural districts in districts like the one I represent in central Washington. I've seen firsthand how these injustices affect local communities, and I have vowed to exercise my position in Congress to help deliver justice for these women. My congressional district sits at the epicenter of this crisis. There are currently over 100 open cases in Washington state, with 31 open cases on or near the Yakima Reservation in central Washington alone. This includes 7 new cases in just the past 5 years. The number of open cases is alarming, but the truth is, we don't even have accurate data to truly understand the breadth of this problem. Due to a lack of shared information, data, and reporting, there's no real way to know exactly how many Native American women have gone missing or whose fate hangs in the balance of an unsolved murder case. The complicated jurisdiction between federal, tribal, and local law enforcement causes serious problems throughout many investigations, and far too many tribal law enforcement agencies lack the resources and access to information that would help solve missing persons cases and murders. This leaves the families and the communities of these victims frustrated, without answers, and begging for solutions. And while we represent them in the People's House, it is the voices of those who are directly affected that we should be listening to. Our communities in my district, in central Washington, have not been silent. Just this past Monday, the YWCA in Yakima hosted their annual vigil for victims of domestic violence. This year, the organization partnered with the Yakima Nation to bring attention to the missing and murdered indigenous women crisis and to honor those who have lost their life to domestic violence. Citizens of the Yakima Nation and other local tribes have hosted rallies of support and large public forums to raise awareness of the crisis and to demand action. A reporter by the name of Tammy Iyer from the Yakima Herald Republic has done a truly excellent job of keeping the public informed of these ongoing efforts, diligently highlighting the activism on the ground and providing resources for families and friends of missing Native women. The voice she lends to the voiceless has and will continue to be a powerful agent for change. I hosted a roundtable earlier this year with tribal members, with law enforcement officers, Bureau of Indian Affairs officials, and other local advocates to learn directly from these pillars of our local community and about how we can assist them in their efforts. I've lived just outside the Yakama Nation Reservation my entire life, Mr. Speaker, but hearing the heartfelt testimonies of the families and the loved ones of missing Native women from just down the road, for me, was truly an eye-opening experience and a deeply heart-wrenching experience. And I believe it is one that all members of Congress need to hear, and that's why we're here tonight. That's also why that in June, I sent letters to the House Judiciary and the Natural Resources Committee, asking them to hold field hearings in Central Washington on this matter. The voices of communities impacted by this crisis must be heard. My request was echoed by numerous local tribes, by advocacy groups, and by women's organizations, who have all sent their own letters to the committee inviting members to come meet with them, listen to the voices on the ground, and discuss solutions for missing and murdered Indigenous women. The Yakama Nation has generously offered to host the hearing, which would provide members of the opportunity to hear firsthand from both the tribes, law enforcement officers, and families of these victims who are dealing with this crisis every day about how we can best move forward. Their testimony would help demonstrate the impact this crisis is having on our communities in Central Washington and in other regions around the country. Mr. Speaker, I hate to tell you, but it has been 4 months since these letters were first delivered to the House Judiciary and Natural Resources Committees. But we have received no response. It's been nearly a month since I testified before the Judiciary Committee to ask for committee action and a response to my letter. Still, nothing. Thankfully, the current administration has been actively pursuing our local input. The Department of Interior is conducting a series of roundtable events with tribes and law enforcement agencies across the country, most recently in Arizona and Alaska. While the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs certainly have a role to play in implementing these solutions for the women and their loved ones, Congress must also pay attention, and we must do our part to listen and then legislate. The 2 legislative proposals I mentioned earlier, Savannah's Act and the Badges for Native Communities Act, would provide immediate assistance to tribes and law enforcement in addressing this crisis. And as you will hear tonight, Mr. Speaker, these bills have strong bipartisan support. I know my colleagues and I stand ready to develop solutions that will work for local tribal communities and law enforcement. And I look forward to hearing from my friends and colleagues from around the country over the next hour to discuss the impact the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women has had on their communities and about what actions this body can help take to stop it. So with that, Mr.